All right, HERstorians, you ready for this week's episode of a little play on history where we talk about her story in Harhats? This is now our third episode, so we have talked about the history, the generations of all the different rights that we've gained access to, how we got here today, who those path pavers were, and what those rights were, what those really important accesses were. How ending slavery, the right to vote, a purse of her own, ties right into today with diversity, equity, and inclusion. We tied that line together. But how are we still here? And who are we going to talk about today? It should come to no surprise to you. Women have always been builders, right? Literally, figuratively, from American settlements to industrial expansion. We have worked with our hands, shaping families, shaping communities, even when we weren't given credit for it. Well, here is a name that you are surely familiar with. One of the earliest recorded women in construction was Emily Warren Roebling, born 1843, passed in 1903. Emily Roebling, who would later become known as the woman who saved the Brooklyn Bridge, wasn't just an engineer's wife. Roebling assumed the role as chief field engineer of the Brooklyn Bridge when her husband fell ill. Fun fact about that bridge, her father-in-law, John Roebling, who designed the bridge, died after a ferry ran over his toes. Ooh. You thought our healthcare system was whack. For over a decade, Roebling oversaw construction, negotiated and helped with materials, and worked tirelessly alongside the workers on site, ensuring the bridge's safe and steady completion. She studied mathematics, material science, and construction methods, but not because she was allowed to, more so because she refused to be left out. Roebling was the first person to cross the bridge upon its completion, in a carriage, with a rooster, as a symbol of victory. In episode 1, I mentioned that these women would come from all manners of backgrounds. Some poverty, some wealthy, others yet born into slavery. For this next her story, she may have been born into the very seat of privilege. And remember, privilege doesn't always mean money. Sometimes it just means location, location, location. Very little is known about the early years of Alice J. Hands, born November 1874, died November 1971, almost 98 years old. But what a life she lived. Hands had a passion for art and drawing, and she was enrolled in the Young Women's Christian Association, or the YWCA, which you may be familiar with. At that time, there were no other schools of architecture open to women, and when the New York School of Applied Design for Women opened in 1892, Hands was one of the first to enroll. There, Alice Hands would meet the woman who would become her friend and business partner, Mary Nevin Gannon. Hands and Gannon took every opportunity to excel in their chosen profession. In their third year at the school, they were awarded second prize in the competition for the women's building at the 1895 Cotton States in the International Exposition in Atlanta. Post-graduation, the two opened the first ever all-women's architecture firm in the United States called Gannon and Hands Architects. The two became known for three things: standing firm for equal pay to their male counterparts and receiving it, understanding and focusing on tenement and low-income worker housing, and focusing their drawings on those complexities. By 1897, Gannon and Hands both were recognized as established New York practitioners, identified in newspapers as the two young women who planned the Florence Sanitarium and solved the tenement problem. By all accounts, business prospered. In October 1898, a reporter for the St. Paul Globe described Alice Hands as someone who has not only made herself rich, but has gained a name in the field of architecture. Hands left the younger generation this advice, a quote, "After a woman has secured technical training, there is no better opening wedge to the money-making world than to become identified in some way with a well-established architecture firm." You hear that, ladies? Although the two parted ways and their respective careers continued in separate states, who knows what impacts the mark they left for women in construction and women in architecture are today. And that is why we do the difficult task of standing up for ourselves. Because when we do, we stand for all women, just as Maya Angelou said. And that was this week's episode of Her Story in Hard Hats. See you next week.